Dis-
Sorry for
Thank
that.
you. Distinguished professor at Georgia State, how does the CRC relate to your work on children's rights in the United States?
Thank you, Barbara. Good morning, everyone. So when you're in the South, people are expected to respond to that. You can't just say. So I won't make everyone do it again, but you'll know if you are at a conference in the South. My work focuses on children's rights. That's the core of my work. That's essentially all of my work, and off to a good start. This doesn't count in my 5 minutes. How's this? Better? Okay. Yeah, so I focus on children's rights. I work on a variety of issues: domestic implementation of children's rights law in the U.S. and elsewhere, human rights education, how do children learn about and come to understand their rights and their responsibilities to respect the rights of others, youth participation, which I'll talk about in a moment, and then child trafficking, which I had worked on for about the last 25 years. I want to take a step back and to these core principles, or what's known as the general principles of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, Articles 2, 3, 6, and 12, which are recognized as the foundation of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And essentially, they create the obligation on states to ensure that every child has the opportunity to develop to their full potential without discrimination of any kind, that it imposes a mandate that policymakers have the best interest of the child as a primary consideration when making decisions, and then children have a right to participate in decisions that affect their lives. Along with that comes an obligation to give due weight to those views consistent with the age and the maturity of the child. And so one other important thing to note about the right to participate, which is going to be the focus of my remaining 3 minutes and 10 seconds, is that there's no minimum age requirement. And I think that's really different from how we think about children's rights in the United States. So the right to participate in children's rights law in the CRC accrues to all children. If you can form a view, you have a right to express that view and have it be taken seriously. That's very different from moments in US law where, for example, the mature minor doctrine has a minimum age below which you won't even be considered in terms of, are you mature enough to express a view on how decisions will affect your life. My work in this youth participation Article 12 context is really focused on civic engagement in recent years. I'm really interested in elevating youth voice and having young people play a significant role, creating spaces for young people to play a significant role in civil and political discussions and dialogue. And the current framework is really quite discouraging in the US for civic engagement when you think about it from a youth perspective. So we all know, obviously, children don't have a right to vote. They cannot qualify to serve in office, so they can't participate politically in any way. And then they have, with respect to other relevant rights to civic engagement, like speech, assembly, and association, they really have what I would call a sort of junior version, right? So you have speech rights like an adult does, but they can be constrained in a school in a way that we don't impose on adults. Freedom of assembly and association are constrained by status offense laws in all 50 states. So in some ways, they have a version of rights, but not the coextensive with adults. And then there's sort of indirect constraints. For example, child labor restrictions, and this is not a call to roll child labor restrictions back. I'm deeply troubled by the current trend in the United States to chip away at child labor protections. But the reality is, because children cannot work and do not work for the most part, or many do, but in a limited capacity, they have no economic power. And so in the United States, if you can't vote and you have no economic power, you have little say in the political process. And so really what we've created is this regulatory framework on civic engagement for youth, where they're pushed to the margins and they're really only recourse is to operate largely outside of the system. And that's pretty discouraging. And really, in terms of developing law and policy that's effective and has a positive impact on the rights and well-being of children, we're really limiting ourselves. We know civic engagement benefits children and youth when they have those opportunities. It builds self-esteem, it builds critical skills, and is really important to healthy child development. We also know it benefits communities. Children have expertise in their lived experience, and I think that's often overlooked. But the reality today is, just to give two quick examples, children and maybe now young adults are the only ones who know what it's like to grow up in an era of social media. Young people are the only ones today who have any idea what it's like to go to a school in a pandemic, unless there happen to be some 105-year-olds in the audience today. And so they have a lived experience expertise that we ought to be drawing upon. But it's not just drawing upon, and what Article 12 and participation rights tell us is that, and what youth tell us themselves, is that they really are ready in many instances to take leadership roles. And so what my work really focuses on is trying to think about how we create spaces where young people have opportunities to realize their Article 12 rights and play a critical role. They're already doing that in many respects on climate change, school safety, gun violence, immigration, racial justice. And I think there's opportunity for us as adults to be better partners in supporting the realization of their Article 12 rights and other related rights that gives them an opportunity to participate in their communities in really meaningful ways. So I think that's probably about 5 minutes, and I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Very much, Jonathan. That was very quickly said. Very helpful. Jane. Next, Professor Jane Spinak.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm Jane Spinak. I am an emerita professor of law from Columbia. My area of expertise is really around representing children, representing parents, analyzing the family court and other parts of the court system. And I will say right up front that I'm not an expert in children's human rights, though one of my students who is sitting here today, Mike Bohanec, definitely is. So you can ask him those questions. But early in my teaching career, in the 1980s, I was conscripted by a woman named Cynthia Price Cohen, who I think just by her force of nature got people to participate in drafting and advocating for the CRC. And despite the US's abysmal record, I have, from time to time in my career, dipped into the CRC, mostly for inspiration. I have always thought about it as a signifier, a place where our aspirations for children and families would be supported by the positive rights that are included in the CRC. I think, as Jonathan said, it recognizes the child as an emerging individual with perspectives and ideals and interests and opinions that are worthy of support and protection. It also, and for me, this was very important, identifies that families can't be the nurturing site for children to grow and develop in their full capacity without affirmative and sustained assistance from the state in many facets of the child's life and the family's life, and at a minimum in health, education, food, and shelter, all of which we don't do. So the CRC for me has always been about what adults owe children so that they can use their own human rights. Very infrequently, that aspiration is found in domestic decisions, specifically or by allusion to the CRC. And for me, the real example is most famously Justice Kennedy citing the CRC in Roper v. Simmons in 2005, where the death penalty for children was eliminated in 2005. But he does cite the CRC. When 5 years later, he writes his opinion saying there should be no mandatory life without the possibility of parole for non-homicide cases, he still nods toward the international community standards, but the CRC, unfortunately, is not mentioned. And by the time we get to Justice Kagan's determination that there can be no mandatory life without a possibility of parole for anyone under 18, she has stopped looking at international standards at all because, you know, she probably couldn't get the majority in that opinion if she did. I want to mention one other case because it is one of my favorites. It's called JDB v. North Carolina, and it is not about cruel and unusual punishment. It's about whether a child believes he or she is in custody and therefore should have Miranda rights. And this was a case about a child in school with both school officials and school police. And Justice Sotomayor said, you have to take into consideration the child's age. And I always thought that in the back of her mind, she was thinking about age as an aspect of human rights. That is, even if you are young, you have the protective power of rights that are greater than the protective power of rights for adults. So I like to think that way. There's absolutely no basis for that. So I'm going to close by saying that in answer for the next round, I also believe that the meaning of best interests of the child in the CRC encompass these broader aspirations that I was talking about. But when we get to our next round, I'll explain how I've changed my mind about that.
Thank you. Thank you. Looking forward to it. Again, a lot to pack. Next, we have Deandra Burton, who's a recent graduate and is working for a firm in Long Island and will speak about child labor rights. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to start my timer to keep myself on track. So my name is Deandra Burton, a recent law grad from Hofstra Law. So excited to be here with you guys today. I am not an expert. I do want to just start off saying that. I have taken a couple of courses. I took an international human rights course with Barbara Stark, and that really, I think, ignited a passion for this subject. And I've just been interested in it ever since. And I think I came across an article maybe a year and a half ago about the weakening of child labor protections. And no one was talking about it. I didn't really hear people talking about it. It had been going on for a little bit now, and it was a bit shocking to me, honestly. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I do have some facts because I just really wasn't aware of this. My friends were connected. And so just to hear no one talking about it, I thought was a bit of a shock. But over the past few years, there has been a push by about concretely 7 to 10 states who are pushing to weaken child labor protections, to allow minors as young as 13 to work, not only just to work, because, we all need jobs, and there are situations where children are required to work to help support their families. But in these situations, the weakening of the protection will also apply to dangerous and hazardous working environments. And we have studies by the Department of Labor as recently as August, or actually it's March of 2023, where we have different factories within, household names. We have Tyson, we have Cargill, brands that we know of, who are allowing children as young as 13 to work on slaughterhouse kill floors and to work with dangerous chemicals. And we have 3 children who actually were injured because of that. And there's 14 separate investigations. A part of those investigations finding at least 600 cases of violations of child labor laws and those protections. And then we have states such as Iowa, Minnesota, Missouri, Nebraska, South Dakota, who are actively working to weaken child labor protections in their states. And we have in Arkansas, where a bill was actually signed into law in 2023, repealing those restrictions. So we have some states who are making the push. We have actual states who have, that push has been finalized and now it's signed into law where children are able to work at very young ages doing dangerous work. And I think as recently as February 2023, there was new findings into an investigation about this. So we have the Department of Labor doing their own investigation, and now we have the Department of Homeland Security who's doing a parallel investigation into this due to the fact that they believe that a lot of the children, a lot of the minors working in these environments may be unaccompanied minors. They may be victims of human trafficking. And so it's becoming a larger issue, not only just to, you know, children working, but is this something larger? Is this something more, more pressing at stake? And I'm just trying to think of what else I want to say about this. Yeah, it's just, yeah, something that's pressing, something clearly that's shaken me a little bit because I really had no idea about any of this. And I'm torn about how the CRC, if that would be helpful or harmful, because we know children have to work. You know, I worked when I was a child, when I was young. I worked at a pool, so it was fun. It wasn't, you know, I wasn't a dangerous condition, but we do have instances where children need to work. And Article 32, Section 1 of the CRC is kind of what I drew on to talk about this. And it kind of states that children are to be protected from economic exploitation, but it also talks about the child's the right to, or how a child shouldn't, or how their work in dangerous conditions or otherwise should not be harmful to their health, physical, mental, moral well-being, social development. And those are all potentially vague terms, right? What does that mean? So I'll talk about that in my next section, but just drawing on that part, obviously, that would be implementing Article 23 would be helpful in terms of, or Article 32, excuse me, would be helpful in terms of the hazardous conditions. Children need to work, right? We either have people within the United States, children who have family here or who are sending remittances elsewhere. They should be able to do that. The right to participate, as Jonathan was talking about, that is something that is important. However, how can we limit this? How can we limit where children are able to work? How can we protect their right to be able to work and help support their families, but at the same time, eliminate this overarching ability for states to repeal these laws and then have them working in dangerous conditions where they could potentially suffer great bodily injury or even death. And so there's a bit of an issue with the language that I'll talk about, but also the importance of it. And I think that's still what I'm balancing right now.
Thank you very much, Sandra. That's a growing concern. And we'll see what happens in November. Joe Becker with Human Rights Watch has been working in this area for some time.
Thank you, Barbara, and good morning, everyone. I'm Joe Becker. I'm the Advocacy Director for the Children's Rights Division at Human Rights Watch, and a pleasure to be part of this panel. What I want to talk about actually flows very well from what Deandra was just describing in terms of regression in state laws on child labor. One argument we often hear in the United States is that it really doesn't matter that the US hasn't ratified the CRC because we already have laws that are protective of children. And in fact, when the convention was first adopted, some critics said, oh, this is fine for, for Libya or for other countries like that, but we don't need it here. So about 3 years ago, a student from Harvard's Kennedy School approached me at Human Rights Watch and said, I would like to test this hypothesis by really taking a hard look at state laws, because many of the rights that are enshrined in the CRC are actually left to the states to regulate and legislate, and see, to what extent do these state laws actually live up to the standards in the CRC, even if we haven't ratified the convention itself. So I want to share with you a little bit this morning what we found. Not surprisingly, the answer to the question of whether our state laws live up to the CRC standards is a resounding no. Pauline is helping me with just some visuals. We didn't attempt to look at all of the issues that are covered by the CRC. That was way beyond our scope, but we did look at 4 specific issues: juvenile justice, corporal punishment, child labor, and child marriage. And Callie, our stellar student from Harvard, looked at 12 different specific laws for each of the 50 states to find out what those standards were. And so based on our assessment of these state laws, we assigned each state a grade from A to F. And as you can see, not a single state earned an A, nor even a B. In fact, we've updated the scorecard every year, and at present we have 9 states that eked out a C, but we still have 14 that failed miserably with an F. So we'll move to the next slide for some specifics on juvenile justice. The convention is very clear that no one should ever be sentenced to life without parole for an offense committed as a child under 18. And we've actually seen a lot of progress in recent years on this, but as you can see from this map, we still have 22 states that allow that sentence. Next one, Paulina. We also looked at whether children can be tried as adults. And every single state in the country allows children under 18 to be tried as an adult in some cases. And in fact, 20 states allow children of any age to be tried as an adult under certain circumstances. Next, we looked at corporal punishment. There are 67 countries in the world that have prohibited all forms of corporal punishment, including in the home. But as you can see, not a single US state has prohibited corporal punishment in the home. And Paulina, the next one, we also looked at schools. There are actually only 3 states that prohibit corporal punishment in both private and public schools. 22 still allow corporal punishment in all schools. And there are 16 states that still allow corporal punishment in penal institutions. Next, you've heard from Deandra about child labor. We do have federal law that applies to child labor that has very weak exceptions for child labor in agriculture. So we looked at the states to see if any states did better than federal law in this arena, and we found no. None set the minimum age for employment in agriculture to 15. 23 have no minimum age. And we also looked, I think the next one is on hazardous. No, go back to the one before. And as you've heard from Deandra already, there are many states that are in fact actually rolling back their child labor provisions at the state level. And then the final issue we looked at was child marriage. Up until 2018, not a single US state prohibited child marriage before the age of 18. Today, the picture looks better. We now have 13 states that prohibit all child marriage without exception under the age of 18. And that's largely because of the really stellar work of Unchained at Last that has taken this, this work on. So these are some of our findings. If you want to Google Human Rights Watch and Child Rights Scorecard, you can find more. But I'll just wrap up by giving 2 of my conclusions. One is that this assertion that US domestic and state laws adequately protect children is obviously false. Not a single state does. But on the other hand, in the absence of ratification of the convention, individual states do have the ability to protect children if they choose to do so. And one interesting thing is that when we first published our scorecard, it was in 2022. And in the 2 years since then, there are 15 states that have actually improved their laws on one of these 4 metrics, primarily child marriage, but also some of the others. And as a result, 10 of them have actually increased their grades. So anyway, that's all for now, but I'm looking forward to the discussion. And I hope I kept myself to 5 minutes.
You were fabulous. Thank you. And you tied things nicely together, and it provided me with a very nice segue. My work on children's right to a free, world-class public education depends on the CRC. First, because it recognizes that education is a socioeconomic right. As Jane pointed out, that means that children have a right to a free education. Children have to be fed when they're being educated. Children who are in shelters have a right to housing, and it's connected to their education. All of these factors affect their education, mostly in that poor schools remain poor under the allocation to the states, which I'll get to later, and as Joe spoke about. So the CRC requires the state to provide free universal public education, secondary education, including vocational education, and higher education on the basis of need. Second, the CRC requires education, public education, and private education to include education about human rights. The preamble to the CRC says that children need to be prepared to live an individual life in society, brought up in the spirit of peace, dignity, tolerance, freedom, equality, and solidarity. And Article 29, 1B puts teeth into that, saying that these are actual requirements that are imposed on the state, on the nation state, to make sure that education includes education. The school curriculum should include education about human rights. Children can't claim human rights unless they know that they exist. And people who don't know that human rights exist grow into adults who don't know how to articulate and claim their human rights. It should be integrated into the school curriculum under the CRC. As the CRC notes in its general comments number 1 and number 5, learning about the CRC and human rights in general has to be part of education as we understand it. Third, and this is probably the biggest major factor, and much of what I wanted to say on this, I think Joe has said in a different context. She spoke about corporal punishment in the schools. The other aspects of education, the map, I'm going to work on my own map if they don't have one, so I will check the website again. Schools are doing, American public education is failing. American public education is in decline. The $122 billion that was provided by the federal government after COVID to enable students to catch up, which experts have said should have needed to be 5 times that amount, was cut off completely, terminated in September. There are schools, districts across the United States that have already spent all of their money. And I don't know what they're going to, on necessary infrastructure, necessary efforts, and they're going to run out. I don't know what they're going to do when they do run out. The schools in affluent suburbs will have auctions and bake sales, and will probably get through. But public schools in our cities and in low-income school districts are really in a desperate situation. leaving responsibility to the states assures that poor states stay poor. Mississippi used part of its federal allocation for education for a Christian rock concert. But without federal oversight, without holding every school district in this country to some kind of coherent standard, children are going to be left with nothing. What they're doing is, in Knox County, where I lived for many years, public school enrollment is down 16%, and homeschooling is up 80%. Reasons to be cheerful. Now, round two. Are we ready for round two?
Ready.
Okay, the question for round two. Jonathan, what is one major risk of drawing on the CRC in your work, and how do you propose to address it?
I'm just supposed to mention one. Okay. I'm going to cheat and I'm going to mention a few risks. I think in the United States, there's a risk today drawing on sort of rights frameworks, not just the CRC. I mean, that's the reality. And with respect to the CRC, that's not really a new phenomenon. If you go back to when we weren't such a divided country 10 years ago, there was still the same conversations and the same resistance to the CRC and politicization of the CRC. And it was used in a lot of sort of broader cultural wars at the time. And, there were threats around the CRC that if we ratified, nannies and blue berets would be showing up at your door and taking your children from you. And that was before the last 10 years. So this is not a new phenomenon. And I think my thought on that is, I think, we have to be strategic, but not scared. There are times when what you're trying to achieve for children can be achieved through a health equity lens, which also faces some resistance, of course, or a child well-being lens. But sometimes you need a rights framework. So we have to be strategic, but not scared. And there, I think about parallels. Colleagues and I have had discussions about this recently. 20 years ago or so, if you had told people, well, civil union's enough, don't ask for more because rights language is threatening to people, that would have led to a very different outcome, right? If we had just stopped there instead of fighting for the right to marriage for all people. And so I think that we have to be strategic, but not scared, as I said. I want to mention two other risks quickly, though, because I think that there are a couple other things happening here that create risks that are not really about the CRC. One is, I think, there's a fundamental misunderstanding about rights in this country and the role of children's rights as it relates to human rights. Children's rights are really foundational to the human rights idea. And the human rights idea says that the mere fact that we are human means that we have rights. If you are not accepting of children's rights, what you are saying is rights are something that the government gives you when you turn 18. Dependent on government largesse is exactly what rights are not, right? It's antithetical to the human rights idea. It's not just about children's rights. So resistance to children's rights is actually a much broader claim in opposition to human rights. And the other thing, I think, a couple other misunderstandings are, one is, I think there's not an adequate understanding, although there's been, in the science world, there's been a sort of tremendous advances in our understanding of child development from birth through adolescence. And a lot of that hasn't filtered into the broader law and policy debates. So you have discussions around, well, how can you argue on the one hand, children should be protected, but they should also have, their voice should matter, and they should have opinions. And I think we really don't understand, we don't bring an understanding of development science into conversations about law and policy. And that really is short-sighted, and it leads to sort of oversimplification and misunderstandings about what children's rights should look like. Having protections in the juvenile justice system in the child labor context, while also giving children opportunities to participate in meaningful ways in the development of law and policy, is actually very consistent with development science. And I think that's an important area that we need to bring to bear on this. And the last thing I would say in this is, law has a very vertical orientation most of the time. And we, as I mentioned earlier, children don't vote, and they typically don't play most of the law that regulates the lives of children has been developed without input from children. And so I think it really requires a shift on our part. I think when I talk to a lot of adults, is this sort of idea that, there's almost children are held to a higher standard, right? You see a teenager in an immature moment. Those of us who work regularly with kids know that the mature and the silly can all come in the same minute, right? But unfortunately, what a lot of policymakers do is they see the immature moment and they dismiss the rest. And so really the risk that's operating here in of using the CRC is it's challenging how we think about children in a way that makes us uncomfortable. We really need to move away from this vertical orientation of development of law to one that's views young people as partners, that's consistent with the CRC and their right to be heard. And I think it will end up with better policy. You develop input, you get input from youth, you develop better policy, better laws, and better outcomes, not just for young people, but also for the community as a whole. So I'll stop there.
That's one of your message on that, Jonathan, is one of the most heartening I've found in the literature. So thank you for it.
Right, I won't say anything more than that.
Thank you for stating it so concisely. Jane.
Okay, well,
same question.
Right. So my first answer was about the aspirational aspects of the CRC. And at the time that I was involved in the 1980s, child advocates at the time overwhelmingly thought of their job as representing children's best interests. So it's not surprising that we all thought that best interests of the child seemed the right standard to use in the CRC, especially because it was believed that the positive rights in the CRC are in the best interests of children. So it's a good standard to use. So in the 35 years since, I have come to understand how problematic the concept of best interests of the child is, and how it allows subjective decision makers in government agencies and courts to use this standard. And as Jonathan said, they don't use it very well because they think that they're deciding about best interests and not about human rights. So domestically, in the name of best interests of the child, we sent thousands of children on orphan trains. We created boarding schools to brutally erase the identities of Native American children. We incarcerated millions of juveniles in the juvenile legal system, and we have destroyed thousands, if not millions, of families through termination of parental rights, all in the name of best interests of the child. And in the name of best interests of the child, advocates for children too often have substituted their subjective opinion of what is in the best interests of the child for what are actually the children's legal interests and their what I call counseled wishes. So as Jonathan said, we don't really ask them for their views. We don't discuss with them what is important to them. Because we think as adult decision makers, we know best. And even though I came to that conclusion about best interests of the child in the domestic sphere, I kept thinking that it was different in the CRC. because, as I said again, because of this idea of positive rights. But in preparing for today, I read a chapter in a book about the last 25 years. It was published a little bit ago, of the CRC. And I read Nigel Cantwell's chapter about the best interests of the child. And I was struck by his argument that it isn't the right standard in the CRC either. He notes that this idea of best interests of the child is only in the CRC, not in other international human rights documents. And he posits, not unlike Jonathan just did, that if children are human and have human rights, they shouldn't be burdened by the subjective opinions of decision makers using best interests of the child. And I agree. Just like domestic courts can distort decision-making about what should, not only courts, but also agencies, about what should be a child's legal interests and their counseled wishes, I now think the same thing is true about the CRC and wish that it didn't have the best interests of the child as the I guess, analytical question about all of these human rights, as opposed to saying, as Jonathan did, these are human rights because children are human and they need to participate in figuring out what they want and how they want it and how also they want protections. I did want to say one other thing that in response to Jonathan, which is I have done a lot of work around how do we think about children's decision-making with what we now know about their brain development. And what the studies have shown is that when you sit down and talk to a child in a non-threatening room and have a discussion with them, they do not have the same impulses that they have when they're out with their friends and doing stupid things like we all did as adolescents. And so I think that that's also an important aspect of it, is that they can be decision makers when they are not in that kind of situation. Last thing, to end on a positive note, I do think the fact that some states and municipalities have kind of endorsed the idea of the CRC, including the New York City Council. And I think we might be able to use those endorsements to push back and challenge other ways in which, in this example, the New York City government treats children by saying, if you want to treat children appropriately, by seeing the CRC as a way to treat is not the word I'm looking for, but engage with young people. You have to stop doing all these other bad things you're doing to them. Okay.
Thank you, Jane. That's illuminating not only for human rights, but for family law. Deandra, what's the major risk you identify and by relying on the CRC, and how do you propose to deal with it in the context of child labor?
Absolutely. So I'm just going to read Article 32, Section 1. It's very short. I just want to be able to have that kind of context when I talk about this. It says that state parties recognize the right of the child to be protected from economic exploitation and from performing any work that is likely to be hazardous or to interfere with the child's education or to be harmful to the child's health or physical, mental, spiritual, moral, or social development. So the first part that I'm going to cheat a little bit. Mine are really short, so I'm going to do two risks. The first one being the possibility of taking away the right to education or vocational paths. And I think there has been a discussion over the past couple of years about alternatives to traditional schooling. Does every child adhere to the traditional schooling? Some people learn in different ways. And so there could be a push for vocational programs in more schools that can sort of cater to that, to those findings. And I think that in ways the CRC could limit that, could limit the potential to instill vocational programs in schools. And again, like I said, there are situations where children need to work. So while the CRC would be able to create limits on areas where children could work, I think that if we draw too much on the CRC, especially for example, Article 32 and how it's a pretty, I mean, it's vague in certain ways, but it also just doesn't allow for a lot of room for work. And I think that there is a way around it and it can be used as a foundation. I think that there are areas of the CRC, but I'm specifically talking about Article 32 that could put limits on vocational programs. And I think that those could be important. We don't want to limit that. The biggest risk that I do want to talk about is the language, right? This section that talks about harmful to the child's health, physical, mental, spiritual, moral, or social development. That I think is up for interpretation. And that could really mean a lot of different things. And how do we, on a federal level, how do we distill that? What does that mean? Moral, social development. I think when I first thought of it, I really looked at that social development aspect. And I thought about if children have to work to support their families, they could potentially be missing out. First of all, thinking about when children are working, obviously can't be during school hours, but if they are homeschooled, those limits aren't there. So parents can create hours. So they could be working, a 9 to 5, they could be working throughout the day. And that I think creates issues, but also around social development in school, extracurricular programs, sports programs, after school programs, things like that. If children have to work or children choose to work, because some kids just want to, and that's great development in and of itself. But if you're missing school, if you're supplementing work as for an extracurricular, you're missing out on that social development that I think is really important. And I think we saw can be detrimental during COVID when children weren't able to socialize in those ways. I think we're going to see the developments of those coming down the line, but I think that language is really vague. What does that mean? Mental, spiritual, moral development. What do those terms mean? And I think that the gray area can cause a lot of political and legal issues, especially when we're talking about categorization of jobs, categorization of employment that is hazardous versus not, that is dangerous to your mental, spiritual, moral development or not. How do we categorize those things? And then the legal issues that come from that, okay, let's say that we do create a framework. There is something there that we can go off of. Are organizations, are corporations going to come forward with these like 14th Amendment equal protection arguments? How come this is categorized as acceptable work, but what we do isn't? Ours isn't inherently dangerous, but for some reason, we aren't able to hire young children, but you are. And I think that opens a lot of doors and a lot of arguments. And I think that, with time, those things can get worked out, but I think it is important to think about those things on the forefront. How are we able to distill this, to categorize it in a way that, predominantly works for children, but also doesn't create tension in corporate America, which there, I think, is enough of. So how do we kind of quell that when the time comes?
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Walking a tightrope.
So there's no doubt that the Convention on the Rights of the Child has gotten a very bad rap in the United States. And I want to share just some of my favorite quotes from conservative critics after the convention was first signed. They described it as the most insidious document ever signed by an American president, the most dangerous attack on parents' rights in the history of the United States, and a tool for perverts. They said that the convention would, quote, put an end to parenting as we know it and would give children a fundamental right to rebel against their parents. And they forecast all kinds of, doomsday outcomes, like Jonathan mentioned, nannies in blue bonnets coming to take your children away. Also saying that it would be up to social workers, not parents, to decide on children's religion, health, and other issues. Jonathan and I were talking just yesterday about some of these early days when members of the US Senate reported that they were getting 100 letters against the convention for every one letter in support of ratification. The convention is clearly not a big point of discussion in the US at the moment, largely because there's no real path to ratification, given the makeup of the US Senate and the required threshold of 2/3 approval for ratification. But, the drumbeat of parental rights is still very strong in the US, especially when it comes to issues around gender identity, book bans, the content of education, sexual and reproductive health, et cetera. And groups do continue to pit children's rights against the so-called rights of parents. But I very much like Jonathan's phrase that we should be strategic but not scared. I think we do need to continue to stand up for the principles and for the convention itself, highlighting that there are so many articles in the convention that highlights the role and the responsibilities of parents in the lives of their children. And I also think that, we're in a very different context now compared to 35 years ago. As we all are keenly aware, the US is the only country that has failed to ratify, leaving us very isolated. And I think we see negative effects in terms of the US's credibility on the international stage when it comes to advocating for children. Secondly, over these last 35 years, the US has ratified 2 of the optional protocols to the convention, which have led to demonstrable improvements in the lives of children in the United States. Before the US ratified the optional protocol on children involved in armed conflicts, 17-year-olds were routinely sent into combat. But after ratification, the armed services changed their policies, and they've been successfully able to do this. And the policies, in fact, are no longer controversial. So we have, some positive impacts from the optional protocols. And then I think third, over the last 35 years, we can show clearly that the doomsday forecasts of all these critics, in the early 90s have not come to pass in, the scores of other countries that have ratified the convention. And in fact, the constructive dialogue with the committee, has often led to very positive, and forward progress in laws and policies in these other countries. So, hopefully ending on the positive, I think the phrase of strategic but not scared is what I'm going to take from this panel.
Thank you. That is about as upbeat as I can hope for. I'm going to be very brief. I want to hear questions from panelists and from all of you. My major risk in relying on the CRC in advocating for public education is my neighbors' ire. My neighbors all have long signs saying, "Save our schools!" exclamation point. This is on the North Shore of Long Island. What they mean is we really need stadium quality lighting for the football field. $60,000 per pupil really isn't enough for our kids. The way that I propose to deal with that, first of all, is my neighbors don't read law review articles. But more broadly, Kenneth Roth has suggested that measures short of ratification, which everyone concedes, and Jonathan pointed out at the very beginning. Kenneth Roth of Human Rights Watch, previously Human Rights Watch, has said that they can be important. And his example, he cited Jimmy Carter's reframing of human rights as part of human rights foreign policy. And this was, although Ronald Reagan quickly reneged on Carter's commitments in Central America, for example, he still ended up institutionalizing the State Department reporting on human rights and pushing on change, democratic change in Chile and the Soviet bloc. If we elect the first Black South Asian woman president, she would be well positioned to frame social issues, especially education, in terms of human rights. Some might argue that she, along with Tim Walz, a former public school teacher who established a universal school lunch program as governor of Minnesota, already have. The Biden-Harris administration secured billions of dollars to fund schools serving low-income families. She supports free 2-year college tuition for most students and free 4-year college and trade school tuition for those from lower and middle-income families. She has criticized efforts to ban books. If Donald Trump wins another term, in contrast, he has proposed eliminating the U.S. Department of Education, expanding parental rights, and returning prayer to public schools. He supports universal school choice programs, which would allow a student's allotment of public education funds to be used for private schools, religious schools, or homeschooling. I would love to leave upbeat, but it's going to be up to the rest. My major upbeat message is Jonathan's be strategic, not scared. I'm scared. But I'm a little bit hopeful because the bottom line is I also, like my neighbors, want to save our schools. My project is to convince them that really requires providing decent education for all American children rather than the equivalent of fancy private school education on the public dime for theirs. Questions? Oh, good. I don't know your name. Could you identify yourself? Okay. Thank you. And then.
So in my international human rights class last year, one thing that we studied was the issue of unaccompanied minors that had come here. They were assigned like almost a host family and then ended up being exploited by that family and, you know, working in very dangerous conditions. Many of them ended up dropping out of school because they work over night, like nighttime and stuff. And the government has failed to address these situations by sending private auditors and different things, even though the law is already banning this. So I was just wondering if you guys thought that ratification of the CRC would provide some relief to these types of issues or change the situation at all, or basically just any ideas you had on the situation and how the government can better address it. Thank you.
Or you're addressing anyone who wants to take that. Okay, Joe and DeAndres.
Yeah, I think this issue was really brought to light very powerfully by, trying to think of her name now, but a journalist from the New York Times who's, yeah, Hannah Dreier, who won a Pulitzer for her powerful series on unaccompanied minors who were being exploited in US factories, like Deandra was saying. Yeah, I mentioned in my presentation that the US federal law, when it comes to child labor, the main weaknesses in the area of agriculture. But the child labor that Hannah documented was largely in areas like factories that are regulated by US existing law and are already considered violations. And, I don't want to be an apologist for the US government, but we do talk regularly with the US Department of Labor. And, in response to these reports, they did significantly scale up their monitoring and enforcement efforts. And there have been, a number of, multi-million-dollar, fines against companies that have been employing children. There's always more that they can do. They don't have the resources that they need, but there's definitely been an uptick in monitoring activity. But because it's already violations of US labor law, I'm not sure that CRC ratification would add very much to the picture or prompt the US to do much different than what they're doing right now in this sector. But Deandra, do you want to?
Yeah, no, you pretty much covered it. Yeah, I was just gonna talk a little bit about the fines, and that is one way that, they're trying to combat this, but when you have very wealthy companies getting fined, maybe a couple million, it's not the end of the world for them. So of course, no, you don't want to lose profits. That's not what they're after, but it's just, I don't want to say it's not effective. It's just, is it going to be the push that changes them? Is it going to be the push that is a deterrent? I don't think so. I think it has to be something else. Are criminal penalties too severe? Potentially, it is like, what is going to be the deterrent? Because obviously monetary fines isn't, and a lot of times it's usually not. So it has to be something a bit stronger. I don't know, but yeah, what is ratification of the CRC, like you're saying, is that the way forward? Potentially no, because even we have these federal laws in place and they're being violated as we see, increasingly. And has there been much change? We'll see, but I think the CRC alone might not be able to get it done to be enough of a deterrent where these companies don't still see the benefit of using this, exploited work.
Cost of doing business. Jonathan, did you want to say something?
Yeah, so a quick few thoughts, because your question is really not just about the issue you raised, but it cuts across a number of areas. And I would say, those of us who work on legislative policy initiatives know two things. One, it's really hard work. It takes a long time. It's imperfect. And then when you have that wonderful signing ceremony, that's when you actually need to get to work, right? And so that's true of every area, every sector we'll talk about today. It requires constant work. And I think part of that raises the point that Barbara mentioned in passing, which is the value of human rights education. In addition to addressing immediate concerns about rights violations, I think we need a conversation and work on how do we build a rights respecting culture. And human rights education is a part of that. Article 42 of the CRC requires that states make the provisions of the CRC widely known, not just to children, but also to adults. And that's largely been ignored in the US. There's very little human rights education. So I think we really need to ultimately get to sort of moving upstream and creating that culture where there aren't the rights violations in the first place, where people embrace law and we don't have such a hard time sort of policing it. The last thing I'd say, and then maybe this is a little bit controversial, so maybe I should stop right here. But I think the way we typically think about social justice issues in the United States and responses when we think in the law and policy arena is we think about the stick. Should we impose penalties, criminal sanctions? That's how we typically respond. And I'm on board with holding perpetrators accountable. But I think as the pragmatist in me also thinks we're missing, when we think about the various actors, we're missing something really important, because the stick alone doesn't necessarily work. And it may have some unintended consequences. We need to think about incentives. And I know that sometimes feels really uncomfortable. Do you really want to provide credit and incentives to corporations just to do the right, humane, rights-respecting thing? I'm with you on that. But I'd also sort of point out that we do that at an individual level, right? Charitable donations spike between Christmas and New Year every year. And it's not just the Christmas spirit. It's people racing to get the tax deduction, right? because we incentivize people to support nonprofit organizations. And so at least we should be open to this idea of how do we actually create motivation. And I'm not saying give tax credits to corporations for doing the right thing. That's not my argument. But I'm saying I think there's a conversation to be had about how do we not only use a stick, and we think about, you know, what motivates businesses to do better, and can we encourage that?
Thank you. Michael.
Thank you. Michael Bohenik from Human Rights Watch. I'm glad you had the discussion about best interests, and in particular the critique of it, because I was hoping that that would come out of this panel, and it's something we've been concerned about, I think, in the area for a very long time. It's a very good concept if applied correctly, and yet has the potential for misuse. And you've identified very concrete ways in which it has been misused. I'm wondering about guardrails that could be, you know, these concepts are interpreted by the committee. We have the chair of the committee is with us. We can refine it through national practice. This concept, I think, was largely drawn from U.S. domestic legal developments, and so domestic developments here could indeed refine the way that it's used potentially elsewhere, although maybe that moment has passed. But in any event, it feels to me like this is an area where we have already a lot of specific provisions, both in the convention and in other instruments dealing with child rights protections, and also an opportunity to limit or to give guidance to adjudicators to apply this in the spirit that it was intended. So this is really for Jane and Jonathan, but maybe others have ideas about this.
Great question.
You know, I think that the challenge with this standard is that it is so subjective. So in the context of the CRC, is it possible to develop a more objective standard of what that means? I mean, that's one way to go, right? Criteria that are necessary in making such a determination. We've been pretty unsuccessful domestically in doing that. I think that one of the ways in which at least lawyers for children have moved is to recognize that their job is not about best interests. It's about what is the child's legal interest, what are their wishes, and how do you have a dialogue with them at any age. And even, you know, when you can't have a dialogue, you see your client so that you're not making decisions just because, well, I have to substitute judgment, so here's my judgment. So in a court-based context, if you've got one of the advocates taking that kind of perspective, it really does change the discussion in the courtroom. It's a harder thing to do, I think, for state agents. And so I would say that if those of you working on what does the CRC mean, forced yourself to struggle with how do we define best interests of the child so that it reinforces the humanness, not the childness of children, in order that it just not be another place where adults make decisions. I don't think I have more, but maybe Jonathan does.
Don't expect too much. Yeah, I'll add two thoughts. One is, I mean, I think this highlights that we, you know, in a lot of these contexts, we need much better support for family. This is a much bigger change, right? But we wouldn't get to a lot of these best interest determinations and deliberations and bad decisions if families had more meaningful support in the first place. So I think there's a sort of larger project there. And then the other thing I think we need to be thinking about is who are the decision makers, right? And though we've improved, we still really lack diversity and representation in who the decision makers are in a lot of these contexts. And so, yeah, so it's a judgment from a totally different world being imposed on kids that by people who don't have any lived experience understanding what those young people are going through, what the family's experiencing. And, you know, I think training can be helpful. I'm more skeptical on the one-off training that has no evaluation and there's no follow-up. But I think we have to have some pretty serious conversations about sort of who's making the decision and how do you sort of incorporate more diverse views where people genuinely understand the lived experience. So it's still going to be imperfect, but you know, this is the old debate between rules versus standards. Rules have their own issues and standards have that flexibility, but that invites a host of challenges.
One point to build on that or to add to that is recent polling suggests that Jonathan's point about support for families, Americans support childcare, paid childcare. Americans support universal pre-K. There is some support for families. There is substantial support for families out there, but I don't think that these are the issues that people necessarily vote on. Other questions? Yes.
Hi, my name is Mari Wong, and I had a question about the way that the United States can start to bring up the rights of the CRC. The United States has a lot of issues in ratifying treaties beyond the CRC and conventions, but it seems that because of the new domestic concerns with child mental health and child protections, specifically in regards to social media, AI, and new technological developments, that they're starting to bring in conversations about child protection. And do you think that this conversation that's happening in Congress is an avenue in which we can start bringing the rights that we hope to see from the CRC into domestic conversations without necessarily making it an international conversation?
You know, there's two sides to this coin again. You know, on one hand, you're right, there is a conversation happening right now about the impact of social media and, you know, concerning data around mental health on children as a result. And so, you know, there are members of Congress that are paying attention and putting forward legislation, and it does provide some opportunities. But at the same time, you know, there's also a big risk in that, you know, legislators go overboard. They limit children's access to critical information that can also dovetail with, you know, the move to try and, you know, curtail children from exploring their sexuality, LGBT rights, trans rights, et cetera. So it's, you know, how do we balance protection with children's right to information? You know, they're, especially when they're not able to gain that information through normal channels that are open to them. So, you know, it is a conversation that, you know, we need to be part of, but we need to navigate it really carefully. Yeah. And, you know, the technology is also advancing so quickly that, you know, staying ahead of it is almost impossible. Anyone else?
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to, you know, Congress, I echo what Joe says, Congress moves really slowly, if at all some days. You know, I think the tension is always going to be there between protection and, you know, sort of agency and sort of agency rights versus protection. I think in terms of technology, we need to think about it as a locale, right? This is a space where young people spend time, right? And if you think back to other spaces in a generation or more ago, our reaction to kids getting injured on playgrounds wasn't to put up police tape and ban people from being on playgrounds. It was to develop safer equipment, and reduce, make the conditions safer. So that requires sort of corporate partners to play a meaningful role in the tech context, since they sort of own those spaces. But we should think about that as a space. That's the public square today. That's the modern day public square, is the digital environment. And there's a tendency, as you pointed out, to immediately go to sort of the harms, but let's also recognize what it's done. The work that young people did on, advocating for action on school shootings would not have happened in the way, at the scale it did post-Parkland, without social media. Greta Thunberg, if she had done that, 25 years ago, it would have been a, charming story in a local paper, right? Instead, it's a global movement because of social media. And I think we recognize that. Now, I'm not convinced every policymaker loves the idea that children are empowered and doing big things. So that's a separate issue. But I think we need to keep in mind and keep reminding ourselves and policymakers that there's some really powerful, amazing things happening in this space, which also carries risk. And so, yeah, it's challenging.
I just want to add a historical note. Every time a new technology or a new media is created, almost the first response is, this is bad for children. Comic books, right? Television. Now media, social media. I know there was one in between that I'm forgetting. The ban was the fax machine. Thank you. Banning books is almost always about controlling children. And so I do agree with Jonathan that we have to have a structured way in which to respond to this, that both provides information, both to young people and to adults, because right now what we're doing is scaring everyone. And I do think that we do know more about the problems with young people's mental health, but it's not just about the fact that they're on social media so much. It's all these things we've been talking about that have been disintegrating in our society. And there's an interplay there, but we always should be on the lookout for this scare tactic that is, historically just always built around children, and how to respond to that in a way that does what, I don't need to say it again, what Jonathan said.
Can I add 2 sentences? I mean, I think even with what the harms are, we're not even focused on most of the time on the right harms. It's the narrative is the predator online, which yes, affects some number of kids, but the much bigger problem is how it interacts with all children's and adolescents' brain behavior, their sort of isolation. So we're not even, when it comes to harms, we're not even really focusing on the harm that's really hurting most kids, which, is a larger conversation.
Thank you. I think I know we're out of time. I want to thank this fabulous panel. I've learned a lot. I hope you have, and thank you for the questions.
Yeah.